Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Christmas dinners are supposed to be messy in a harmless way, too many side dishes on the table, a cousin telling a story that goes nowhere, maybe an argument about politics that fizzles out once the pie is served, but that night was different. And the air in the dining room felt as if it had been waiting all year to crack like ice under weight. The table was crowded with the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon, the clink of glasses, the forced laughter of people who wanted to pretend everything was fine, and then my father cleared his throat the way he always did when he was about to deliver something sharp. Something designed to cut through the noise and make sure nobody forgot who was in charge. He looked directly at me, his fork resting on his plate, his face tightening into that smirk I knew too well, and he said, "You're a burden, and you can't stay with us anymore." It was as if the room shrank in an instant. Forks paused midair, the laughter dissolved into silence, and I felt every pair of eyes sliding toward me, waiting to see how I would react. My brother coughed awkwardly, trying to mask a grin. My mother shook her head ever so slightly, but didn't open her mouth, and the cousins kept their faces carefully neutral as if they had suddenly discovered their mashed potatoes were fascinating. I wanted to laugh, to remind them of the mortgage payment I had quietly covered 3 months ago when my father's hours were cut, of the hospital bill for my mother's procedure that had been shoved onto my credit card, of the utilities that always seemed to be accidentally in my name, but instead I sat perfectly still, my hand tightening around the stem of my glass. There is a particular humiliation that comes not from strangers, but from family, because when strangers wound you it's easy to write it off as ignorance, but when your father declares you a burden at his table, in front of people who have no idea that his paycheck barely covers his car lease, it feels like being set on fire by the very hands that raised you. I forced myself to breathe, to look around the table, to notice the tacky centerpiece my mother bought on clearance, the gravy boat that had a crack running down its side, the flickering lights on the artificial tree leaning in the corner, and in that moment I thought, they believe they can cut me out, and yet they are standing on a floor I have held up for years. My mother tried to soften the blow with a half-smile, murmuring something about how maybe it was time for me to be independent, but the word landed with the weight of a lie, because I had been independent for years. I had been the one wiring money when their fridge broke, when my brother wanted a down payment for his used car, when holiday gifts magically appeared under the tree even though no one else had the funds. The irony of being called a burden while silently carrying theirs almost made me choke on my wine, but I held my tongue. My brother, always eager to twist the knife, leaned back in his chair and said with a laugh, "Dad's right. Maybe it's time you figure things out on your own." The smugness in his voice made me want to slap the plate from his hands, but instead I let my eyes linger on him, remembering the insurance premiums I had slipped him money for when he forgot to renew. The weekend trips he bragged about that were funded with loans I knew would never be repaid. I wondered if he even realized that without me, his entire fragile image of success would collapse like a house of cards. The rest of dinner carried on in an uncomfortable rhythm, people trying to pick up the conversation as though nothing had happened, but I noticed the stolen glances, the way some of them shifted in their seats as if they knew the words had been too harsh, too final. Even for my father. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't defend myself, because I realized in that moment that defending myself would mean acknowledging his claim, and I had no intention of giving him that satisfaction. Instead, I sat back, listened to the chatter, and thought about every payment, every receipt, every sacrifice I had quietly made that could unravel the smug comfort surrounding this table if I ever decided to pull the thread. When dessert arrived, I smiled politely, passed the pie down the line, and let my father believe he had won the night. He toasted my brother for some small achievement at work, my mother fussed over the whipped cream, and I stayed quiet, watching, waiting. Beneath the silence I carried a storm, the kind that doesn't need thunder to be dangerous. Revenge doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it waits for the right moment to step into the light, and as I sat there, my fork cutting through pumpkin pie I could barely taste, I decided I would not give them anger. I would give them absence, and absence, when it's tied to money, can feel louder than any words. When the dishes were cleared and the evening wound down, My father looked at me one last time as if to say the decision was final, as if he had settled something permanent with a single cruel sentence. I met his gaze, held it longer than I ever had before, and let the corner of my mouth curl just enough to suggest that he had no idea what was coming. Because while he believed he had thrown me out, what he had really done was open the door for me to walk away carrying every secret that kept their lives stitched together. And that, I thought as I stood to leave the table, was a burden I was finally ready to drop. The morning after that dinner felt like the morning after a long storm that had stripped the leaves from every tree but left the air deceptively clear, and as the house settled into the slow, uneven breathing of people avoiding eye contact after a public wound, I carried a stack of flattened boxes from the garage to my room and began to fold my life into cardboard with the kind of methodical calm that makes other people nervous, because it suggests a plan has already been written, signed, and sealed without their input. I moved through drawers and closets like an audit in human form, laying clothes in neat layers, tucking framed photos between sweaters, coiling the cords of chargers I had bought for everyone but somehow always kept in my room. While on my desk, I opened a manila folder that had been growing for years, a careful chronicle of every time I had reached into my pocket to fix some emergency that only ever had one designated first responder. There were utility confirmations, with my name on them even though the bills arrived in my parents' mailbox, credit card statements highlighting grocery runs that magically became holiday meals, hospital invoices stamped paid because I had been the adult in the room when the nurse handed us the clipboard, and a tidy printout of the auto-pay list I had set up when the electricity company threatened to charge a reconnection fee. A list that now looked like a lineup of hostages waiting to be released. I remember pausing at the window with an old scarf in my hands, watching the driveway where snow had been shoveled just enough to perform respectability for the neighbors, while underneath the thin order you could see the uneven ridges of neglect. And I thought about how many times I had slipped outside before dawn, coat unbuttoned and hair uncombed, to scrape ice off my father's windshield because he had an early shift and the scraper had somehow vanished, only to hear him later complain that nobody ever helped him, a rewriting of events delivered so confidently that it almost sounded true if you did not know how to keep receipts. The scarf went into the box and the folder stayed open, and with a slow breath I took out my phone and began to act in the way I wish I had years ago. Not with shouting or pleading, but with quiet administrative precision that does not announce itself as revenge, because it wears the clothes of housekeeping while it rearranges the furniture of power. The bank app came first, and I removed my parents as authorized users on a card they had long ago promised to use only for emergencies, but treated like a pantry that restocked itself as soon as the door swung shut. And then I opened the portal for the electricity provider and changed the primary email from mine to my father's, set paperless billing to off so that envelopes would pile on the hallway table where he could not ignore them, and scheduled the auto-pay to end at the close of the current cycle with a bland note that said "moving residence," a phrase so gentle it almost sounded like a favor. I pulled the phone plan into view and generated transfer pins for lines I had been covering in the name of family, in the name of keeping everyone connected, in the name of not listening to my mother cry when the bill came. Writing each pin neatly on a card with the steps required to assume full responsibility, and I slipped those cards into a plain white envelope I addressed to my father in the same firm handwriting I used when I was a teenager labeling boxes for a yard sale, because I had learned early that clear labels make partings easier and also make denial harder. Packing has a rhythm when you are not heartbroken but resolved, and I let that rhythm carry me through the afternoon as the house muttered with half-heard conversations, the distant rattle of dishes, the muted television in the living room where my father watched a talk show with the sound low like a man resting between rounds. Every item I touched became a ledger entry. The winter boots I bought for my mother when her ankles swelled and she would not admit her shoes hurt. The portable jumper cables I kept in the trunk because my brother treated oil changes like a myth. The grocery loyalty card registered to my name that had quietly shaved dollars from their receipts and somehow always surfaced in my father's wallet when he wanted to show how prudent he was. I wrapped the boots in tissue. I placed the cables in a labeled bin. I slid the loyalty card into my purse, and with each small retrieval I felt the house adjust by a fraction, as if the walls were noting that a silent scaffolding had been removed and they might soon learn what it meant to stand on their own. Before sunset, I printed a single-page ledger that summarized the past few years in language so simple it would be hard to twist. Dates, amounts, vendors, confirmation numbers. And beside each line a short note written in a tone that was neither bitter nor forgiving. Winter gas bill during outage, copay after clinic visit, license renewal fee promised to be repaid. And I clipped it to the thick folder like a cover sheet on a thesis that no one had asked to read, but everyone had contributed. 2. I placed that folder in my bag because it belonged to me, and I placed a thinner, carefully curated packet on the mantel in the living room where my father would see it when he stood to turn off the lamp. Inside that packet were the transfer instructions for the phone lines, the scheduled end dates for autopays, a list of accounts that would now contact him directly, and a polite sentence at the top that read, "So you can be fully independent by month's end," which was both a kindness and a blade. When I finally zipped the last box and taped the last seam, I stood in the doorway of my room and took in the strange cleanliness that follows a departure before the departure. And I felt something that was not triumph and not grief, but a steadiness that comes when the ground under you is yours again. I carried 2 boxes to the car, came back for the envelope, and found my father in his chair with the television still whispering, the lamplight yellow against his face. I set the envelope on the mantel with a soft tap that made him look up without speaking. And I met his eyes with a calm that I borrowed from the future. "There's some housekeeping you'll want to look at," I said, not as a plea and not as a threat, but as a closing of a ledger. He opened his mouth as if to form one of his old lines, then closed it again, and the television seemed to fill the space where his voice should have been. I went back to my room, slid the folder into my bag, and as the zipper teeth locked with a final whisper, my phone buzzed with a notification confirming a change of account ownership request submitted for review. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply turned off the light. Because the thing about revenge when it is built out of paperwork rather than shouting is that it does not need an audience. It only needs a clock, and mine had just started. By mid-morning the house had the stale sweetness of leftovers and cold coffee, and the living room carried that awkward daytime quiet that only families who prefer performance to conversation can maintain. So when I walked in with the envelope already open to the page that mattered and set it on the coffee table between the remote and a coaster shaped like a lighthouse, I did it with the kind of calm that looks like surrender to people who do not understand that quiet can be the heaviest hammer in the room. My father did not look up immediately, because the television was droning about some football scandal, and he likes to absorb outrage as if it were a vitamin, but my mother saw the papers and, with that nervous trip of her fingers she uses when bills arrive, asked in a voice trying to be casual whether I needed help with groceries this week, which would have been funny if it were not so practiced. Because the groceries have always arrived as if by magic while receipts disappeared. Like socks in a dryer. I told her, gently and without decoration, that the groceries would take care of themselves. The lights would no longer need my bank to keep them on. The phone lines had transfer pins waiting in the envelope. And the mortgage cushion they treated like a fairy visiting on the first of each month had retired with honors, and I delivered each sentence like a notary reading a simple truth into a record that could no longer be edited. For a second no one moved, and then my father let out a laugh that wanted to be a roar but came out as a cough, the sound men make when they are sure a woman is bluffing, and he leaned back and said, in the tone he saves for scolding waiters, that I was being dramatic. That money is not a weapon, that family takes care of family, and I almost admired the acrobatics required to deliver those words while sitting in a chair paid off by my bonus last spring. I slid the page across the table toward him, the one with the simple list of accounts and dates and the line that read, as politely as a bow on a grenade, automatic payments end upon the current cycle, and he picked it up. Skimmed it in the lazy way of a man expecting to find nothing sharper than a suggestion, then slowed as the meaning settled, reaching the part where the electricity company would now send notices to his email. The part where the phone plan required him to claim the lines. Within a week, the part where the bank would no longer permit charges under my name at his favorite hardware store, and as each line planted itself in his mind, the flush that had crept into his cheeks last night began to recede, leaving behind a paler confusion that did not suit him at all. My brother wandered in halfway through this transformation, hair a mess, wearing that sweatshirt that pretends he ran a marathon when we both know the longest distance he routinely covers is from couch to fridge. And when he realized the mood in the room had shifted from smug to brittle, he tried to stitch it back with a joke about me moving out and finally paying my own way, which floated for a second and then fell like a stone when I turned to him and, with the gentleness I reserve for toddlers who have wandered too close to the stove, explained that the gas in his car, the insurance he pretends is cheap because he is clever at negotiation, the copay he swore he mailed but somehow always ended up processing until I stepped in, and the streaming services he insists are included with his internet package would now require actual math, actual budgeting, and perhaps an acquaintance with the due date printed in bold on an envelope. He blushed, then bristled, then tried to pivot into indignation, muttering that I could not just cut people off right before winter like some villain in a drama. To which I replied that I had not cut anyone off so much as I had let go of the rope I have been dragging behind me while the entire household sat on it, and called it tradition, a metaphor that even my mother, who hates conflict as much as she loves a matching towel set, could not pretend to miss. There was humor in it for me, a dry, bitter humor that tasted like black coffee, because beneath the layered speeches about family loyalty and gratitude there was only the plain arithmetic of bills and wages, and the absurdity of me being painted as a freeloader at a table set with things my card had purchased. I wanted to tell them that if arrogance were a fuel we could all drive for free, but I kept that one for later, because the point was not to score lines but to make space, and space is not created by a perfect zinger, it is created by refusing to carry what is not yours. My father, still gripping the page, asked where I expected them to find the money, as if funds were geese one could simply coax from a bush in the backyard, and I answered with the same even tone I would use with a client, that budgets are choices, that grown adults who run a household must understand the cost of heat and food and phones, and that I had provided a list of steps to make the transition smooth, including due dates and call centers that could, with patience and a pen, guide them through the unromantic miracle of paying for what you use. He stared at me with a fury that was built to be loud, and when it found no purchase on my calm it sputtered and sparked and smoked like a fire denied oxygen. I could feel the room shifting, not in some cinematic way, but in the practical alignment of a family whose story had relied on a hidden benefactor suddenly publicly resigning, and my mother, who knows where reality lives even when she cannot bear to visit it, asked whether the current month was covered, and I nodded, because cruelty has never been my style, and because I wanted the change to be structural, not punitive. I told them that by month's end the accounts would require their hands, and that it was better they learn the lesson on a clear day than during a blizzard or blackout, and while my father opened his mouth to unleash a well-worn sermon about respect and duty, the words did not arrive on time, perhaps because the envelope on the table kept whispering a quieter sermon about numbers that have no interest in feelings. I should have left it there, but I have learned that a small flourish can save a long argument, so I reached into my bag and placed a key on the table, the spare to my car, the one my brother borrowed twice a week under the pretense of errands that smelled like poker night and cheap beer, and I told him he could keep the memory of convenience, because from now on he would need to schedule his own rides or discover the shocking satisfaction of a bus pass. He started to protest and then stopped, because somewhere in the back of his mind a calendar was finally lighting up with all the days I had made easier without asking for applause. My father's jaw worked, my mother blinked away something that might have been tears or just honesty trying to find a way out, and I stood, not dramatically, not triumphant, simply finished with the scene for the day. And I said that I would be out of the house by the weekend, and that I wished them a winter of warm rooms and clear bills, a line that sounded courteous enough to pass at tea, but carried the soft thud of a door closing. As I turned toward the hallway, my phone buzzed with another confirmation. The phone carrier had acknowledged the transfer request and set the clock in motion, and I felt a steadiness spread through me like heat from a well-built furnace, the kind that takes a while to start, and then keeps a whole house alive, and I thought that perhaps I had finally learned the adult version of love, which is not rescue, not martyrdom, but boundaries with receipts. Behind me, the television tried to reclaim the room with a commercial jingle. My father's chair creaked as if it wanted to stand on his behalf, and in that creak there was a new sound I had never heard in this house. Something like the first crack of ice on a pond in spring, quiet and decisive, and I did not turn back, because cliff edges are best observed from solid ground, and I had only just reached mine, even as the first overdue notice, scheduled, stamped, and addressed, was already making its way through the postal system toward our mailbox, where tomorrow's version of my father would open it and, for once, have no one else's pocket to reach for before he reached for his breath. The first signs that the house had started to tilt did not arrive as a catastrophe with sirens, but as small domestic tremors that would have been laughable if they were not so revealing, and on the second morning after my announcement, while I was wrapping glassware in old newspaper and stacking boxes by the door, my phone began to pulse with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat gone anxious. Missed calls from my mother at sunrise, 2 text messages from my brother written in the defensive slang he uses when he wants to sound casual while begging, and a voicemail from the electric company politely asking to confirm a change of contact information that, as it happens, no longer required my confirmation. I listened to the voicemail twice not because the content surprised me, but because the tone did, a measured courtesy that has no interest in family myths. And then I set the phone face down on the counter and watched the morning light crawl across a stack of bowls I had bought during a Black Friday sale because my mother wanted to feel festive, and we all know that festivity, like heat, does not pay for itself. By mid-morning, a neighbor had knocked to ask my father whether everything was all right because the mail carrier had tried twice to deliver a certified envelope and left one of those neon slips that make people straighten their backs and scan the street. And though I did not see the conversation, I heard the strange quiet of it through the wall, that hesitant hush that appears when a man trained to perform certainty finds himself holding a clipboard with his name on the line that says, "Responsible Party." It is not that I enjoyed any of this. Enjoyment is too simple a word for the mix of relief, anger, and faint sorrow that hung inside me like weather, but there was a dry satisfaction in the way reality does its work without asking for applause. And as I folded a stack of shirts I had outgrown but kept because mothers like to believe their daughters will someday return to an old size and an old script, I thought about all the years I had acted as if money were a kindness rather than a boundary, as if cushioning the fall would change the height of the ledge, and I realized that what I felt now was not pettiness, but proportion. The phone resumed its insistence, and this time it was my sister-in-law, who does not waste time on pleasantries when a bill is due, typing with the urgency of a person watching numbers move the wrong way, telling me that the phone carrier needed the transfer pin and the gas company wanted a deposit, and could I please, just this once and for the sake of the kids, delay whatever I had set in motion because my brother was under a lot of pressure at work, which is a phrase that covers a multitude of avoidable sins. I stared at her message and felt the old tug, the instinct to rescue in exchange for temporary peace, and then I replied in a tone I practiced in the mirror the night before, measured and adult, explaining that the pins were in the envelope on the mantel, that the deposit was standard and refundable with on-time payments, and that the kids would be better served by parents who understood due dates than by an aunt who acted as a perpetual extension cord. Around noon, while I was labeling a box with the absurdity of winter scarves and proof, my father called from the living room where the television volume was higher than usual, as if sound could drown out arithmetic, and asked in a voice that tried for fatherly authority, but landed closer to bureaucratic irritation whether I had turned off the autopay for the water bill because the city website would not accept his login. And when I told him I had never had access to the city website because he had insisted for years that he had it handled, he misheard the sentence on purpose and declared that I was being vindictive, that my decision to force independence in winter was cruel, that no good daughter treats her parents like strangers in their own home. I walked to the doorway with a roll of tape in my hand and, choosing words with the care of someone disarming an old trap, said that strangers in this house had always been the truth and the budget, and that I was offering him the Dignity of both, and I watched the sentence land without sparks, as if it were a weight he had not accounted for, heavy but familiar, a thing with the shape of accountability. The ripple effects found their way beyond the drywall before I did, because small towns and well-kept suburbs share information the way vines share fences. And by late afternoon, a family friend texted me a screenshot of a neighborhood group thread where someone had asked whether the power company was changing policies because a certain someone on Elmwood had been seen arguing with a customer service rep on his front step, and though the message was petty and unkind, it made something inside me unclench, not because I wanted my father embarrassed, but because reputation had always been his preferred currency, and now the exchange rate was fluctuating without my input. I closed the thread without responding and refocused on the practical, because revenge that relies on gossip is brittle, whereas the quiet reallocation of responsibility tends to hold. And for that reason, I did one last thing before dinner that I had been avoiding, because it felt like treason even though it was simple good sense. I logged into the credit union where my name sat as an emergency contact on a line of credit my parents swore they never touched, and I removed myself with the same steady fingers I used to add them years ago. Then called the branch and told a patient woman named Carlene that any future loans or extensions issued to the household should not reference my accounts for verification, a sentence that left a taste like metal in my mouth but also gave me back my breath. By evening, the house had been marinated in tension long enough to develop a film on every surface, and when my mother knocked on my door to ask whether I would be home for Sunday dinner to keep up appearances for Aunt Lila, I almost said yes out of habit. Then saw the envelope on the mantel in my mind and chose another habit, one I was still learning, and told her no with a softness that surprised even me, adding that appearances would take care of themselves once the books matched the stories. She nodded with the aching politeness of a woman who knows the ceiling has changed height and cannot find a comfortable way to say it, and then she did something I will not forget. She asked whether the list I left included the number for a budget counselor she once mentioned when the mortgage rate adjusted, and I told her it did, underlined twice, and that if she called on Monday she should ask for Ramon because he had a voice like a seatbelt and would not let her crash. My father did not join the doorway, did not call out a final word, did not even rattle the newspaper he was pretending to read, and the false bravado of that silence made my skin prickle. Not with fear, but with the knowledge that I had finally placed him in a conversation with something he could not interrupt. I ended the day with a small, careful flourish that was more humane than vengeful and therefore more satisfying than either, a charitable donation in my parents' names to the local winter heating fund, not large enough to suggest smugness, not small enough to be symbolic, and I printed the acknowledgement and tucked it inside the envelope of transfer instructions on the mantel with a sticky note that said, in my clearest handwriting, in case you need to ask for help, here is proof that asking works, which was both a lesson and a lifeline and, if I am honest, the only way I could sleep without hearing the old guilt chewing at the baseboards. When I turned off my lamp, the house hummed with a new kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like air pressure before a front, and as I lay there counting backward from 10 to steady my breath, I heard my father's footsteps pause in the hallway outside my door, and then retreat without knocking, a retreat that carried no muttered insult, no half-joked command, only a silence so concentrated it felt like a message being pressed under the door, and I understood that the next words we exchanged would not be about bills or boundaries, but about something older that had been waiting its turn. Which is why I slept in my clothes, keys on the nightstand, ready to carry the final box to the car at first light if his silence came wrapped in the wrong kind of morning. Snow had started again in that stubborn way winter has of insisting on a second opinion. Soft flakes drifting past the crooked plastic candles in the front windows while I carried the last box down the hallway that still smelled faintly of cinnamon and old varnish. And when I stepped into the living room, I felt the temperature of the house more than I felt the air itself, a chill that was not quite in the vents, but in the way the walls held themselves, as if they had learned to brace, and there my father sat in his favorite chair with the television muted and the sunlight picking out the threads in the arms where his elbows had worn the fabric down. And for a long moment, we looked at one another in a silence that contained every Christmas and every argument and every morning I had put gas in his car before dawn without asking to be thanked. I set the box by the door and placed my keys, the spare to the car and the one to the back gate, on the coffee table next to the envelope that now bulged with the printed confirmations of transfers and terminations and reassigned responsibilities, and I told him, in a voice that sounded almost like someone else's because it was so steady, that I had moved the last of my things, that the month was covered so no one would sit in a cold house, that the budget appointment I booked for Monday at noon with a counselor named Ramon was held in both their names, and had the first session already paid for by a grant from the heating fund because pride does not warm a room, and that after that day they would need to decide whether to learn the arithmetic of their lives or continue pretending that arithmetic is a moral opinion. He opened his mouth, and the old reflex looked for its script, the one where he talks until other people's facts exhaust themselves, yet nothing came out but a breath that fogged the edge of the lamplight. And in that small stoppage something shifted in me that was not triumph and not pity, but a recognition that silence, when it is honest, is a tool as sharp as any accusation. And I realized I could leave now with my head high and my credit unburned and my boundaries not written in smoke. I told him there were a few last matters that were mine to control, and that I had handled them in ways that protected me without humiliating him, because even now I believed the difference mattered. The credit freeze I placed on my files at the 3 bureaus so that no one could open a line in my name while claiming an emergency. The fraud alert that would trigger a call if my address appeared on any application I had not signed. The notarized letter in the safe deposit box that clarified the ownership of my grandmother's savings bonds, which had fallen, like so many things in this house, into the category of "we will see." And the simple statement I had filed removing myself as an emergency contact on the credit union account that had been used like a shadow wallet whenever someone wanted to pretend a bill belonged to the future. I watched his jaw tighten, not in anger this time, but in the math of consequences aloud, and I told him, because I would want to be told, that I had left a second envelope addressed to my mother with a checklist she could use if she wanted to build a month that did not end in begging. A list that began with the free pantry hours at the church and ended with the number for legal aid in case anyone tried to solve a shortfall with a signature that did not belong to them. My brother appeared at the doorway with a posture that announced he had rehearsed a little speech about loyalty and family and how I had chosen ambition over love, and I spared him the performance by pointing to the folded registration form on the mantel, the one that would lapse in 10 days if he did not assume his own policy, and I said that I hoped he would take the bus once and let the experience teach him how the rest of the city lives between paydays, not to shame him but to turn his life into an equation that included more than his convenience. He rolled his eyes, muttered something about me enjoying my new apartment like an ice queen. And I let it pass because the lease I was on my way to sign had been earned with years of double shifts and the kind of attention to detail that does not post itself on social media. And because arguing with a man who thinks budgeting is an insult is like trying to fix a draft with compliments. My mother stepped in then with a dish towel twisted in her hands, and in a voice too careful to be casual, she asked whether I would text her the address of the new place in case of an emergency. A phrasing that carried a lifetime of manipulations, but also a real fear that emergencies had always been answered by me, and I told her yes, I would, and that emergencies would only be answered if the word meant what it said, not if the stove ran low on drama or the neighbor saw a certified envelope. And decided to turn it into a story, and her shoulders dropped a centimeter as if the rules, for once, were a relief. I picked up the box and then set it down again because there was one more thing I needed to say, a sentence that had been forming since the pie plates were scraped clean on that first night, and I told my father that I had never been his burden, that I had been his cushion, and that cushions flatten and split when people jump on them and call it love, and that I was leaving not to punish him, but to force him to hear his own house without my hands muffling the hard edges. He stared at me as if he were trying to find the insult hidden in the logic, and when he did not find it he looked at the envelope, and then at the keys, and then at the window where the snow had thickened into a steadier fall. And at last he exhaled in a sound that could have been surrender or could have been a man choosing his next mask, and that ambiguity had always been the weather of this house, so I did not wait for a forecast. I lifted the box, walked to the door, and paused only long enough to press my palm against the wood in a private ritual that felt like both a goodbye and a receipt, and then I stepped onto the porch where the cold bit in a way that felt medicinal rather than cruel. And as I reached the car, my phone buzzed with two messages, one from the credit counselor confirming that the appointment was still on for Monday with a note that said, "Tell your parents to bring the bills and nothing else," and one from an unknown number that contained only a photograph of my father sitting in his chair looking at the envelope as if it were a mirror, and I could not tell whether the photo had been taken by my mother to move me or to anchor herself, which is exactly how our story has always been, half plea and half proof. I started the engine, watched the windshield clear, and pulled away slowly, not because I doubted the decision, but because victory without gloating feels like a muscle you have to warm up, and as the house receded in the rearview, I allowed myself a single thought that was not a threat or a promise, but an opening, that some silences are the first honest words a family ever speaks, and that I would not know until spring whether his quiet meant he had finally heard me or finally lost me. And that, maybe for once, not knowing was the cleanest ending I could give us.